You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless.
Welcome to today's episode of Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless. Peter, great to have you back.
Yeah, it's great to be back, Rick.
So today, as we talked about last episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some decontextualized scriptures. Was that your word?
Yes.
Yes.
I
remembered.
And distorted.
Okay, let's start with one that's fairly common, and most people are aware of this one, but we'll just talk about this one. Money is the root of all evil, quoted from 1 Timothy 6:10.
Yes.
That's not actually what it says.
Yes. Now, tell me what it says, Rick.
It says the love of money is the root of all evil.
Yes, exactly. The love of money is the root of all evil. And that's also where it speaks about you cannot serve God and mammon.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We are not here to live economic lives. And it's interesting, a very famous recent United States president asked, how do you win elections? He said, it's the economy, stupid. And it's interesting, take a look at the current election we're going through. Everybody says it's the economy. And we live in societies which centre their lives on property. A friend of mine who I was working with many years ago, basically decrying the way that life was, he said, look, what is this? Is that we all live our lives and he who dies with the most toys wins.
Yeah.
And it is true that the love of money does divert us, but responsibility with money is an important thing.
So is God against wealth?
No, but an interesting thing, this has been a discussion, quite fascinating discussion, goes back to the earliest century, earliest parts of the church. And the idea of that somehow that if I own something, it was for the benefit of others is very central to Christian faith. In fact, in the last episode, I quoted Ephesians 4:28. Let the thief steal no more, but rather let him labour, working with his hands to have, so that he may give to them that has need. So the idea that our possessions were not ours, that we were stewards of what we've been given for God, is important. Now let me go back. Here's a bit of antiquarian, almost trivia type stuff. It's more than that. It's actually quite serious. This was taken so seriously in the early centuries of the church that in the 8th century, an English divine by the name of Alcuin had this beautiful quote. And quoting from the Latin, I'll play a little bit of accent here. Speaking of the wealthy, he said, the wealthy must understand that they are called to be dispensatores, not possessores.
Mm-hmm. So givers, not holders?
Dispensatores, not possessores. It's a very interesting play on words there, which are completely lost in this day and age. And by the way, Peter Damian gave exactly the same quote in the 13th century. So this idea of the wealthy being dispensators, they are dispensers of what God has blessed them with for the benefit of the world and those around about them. And they are held responsible. Now, what's fascinating is that the term dispensator was a very important Roman household title, that only the wealthy had dispensators in their households, and a dispensator was essentially the most senior slave in a Roman household. And these quotes were picking up this thought. And the dispensator was a slave, a doulos, and Paul refers to him, and in the Greek that's doulos, Paul refers to himself as a doulos of Jesus Christ. We are called to be slaves of Jesus Christ. And the dispensator was the most senior slave. And he was the person who held and distributed and deployed the wealth of the master.
Like we see Joseph in the house of Pharaoh?
Joseph in the house of Pharaoh. He was a slave, right? He was in the house of Pharaoh.
But he was entrusted with everything.
He was entrusted with everything, and his was to make sure that the property of the Pharaoh was dispensed across the land of Egypt to the welfare and well-being of the people. And the wealthy are called, those of us who have wealth and have the capacity to give, we are called to be dispensators of the wealth that God has given us. And that's often translated in our English to the word steward. I like the word dispensator because you've got the idea a dispenser is somebody that is a like you said, it's a river, not a reservoir. We are ones through whom wealth flows,
Yeah.
not ones who hold and accumulate wealth. And so when we come to people say, oh, capitalism, for example, has been the greatest benefit for mankind, I say, yes, the deployment of capital, the concentration of capital, yes, I can see how it's economically efficient. But don't let that justify the selfishness of whatever you have accumulated through the efficiency of capital markets and the understanding of how the concentration of wealth works. If you're a person who has been successful in becoming a focus of concentrating wealth, then you stand before God as one who, if you use that as a reservoir, right, you have failed. And do not think that you get brownie points from letting it flow through you, because that's what you're called and supposed to do. Because remember, you actually don't own it. You are a slave of the one who
does
is
own
the
it.
ultimate source of it. So act like a slave and don't pat yourself on the back because of how wonderfully charitable you are to these poor other people, because that's demeaning, demoralizing and patronizing.
We see two scriptures where Jesus specifically says, one, we have the story of the rich young ruler, where he says to him, go and sell everything you've got. Yeah, you're a good guy, but just you've got a problem with your wealth. Go and sell everything, give it to the poor. And the other one is he says how it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
Precisely.
So he's identifying there's a potential problem with wealth.
Yes.
But he's not saying they're wrong in being wealthy. So talk about, let's take the one of the camel through the eye of the needle. What was he saying there?
Well, he was just basically saying that if you load yourself up with those things, and I think we can, there's a lot of discussions about certain gates in Jerusalem and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
I think that metaphor is quite simple. Think of the eye of a needle and try to put a camel through it. Now, the allusions to the gate in Jerusalem, etc., with the bags on the side, they may be true. And for those of you who don't know, there are people who say there was a special gate in Jerusalem that camels could get through if they didn't have big saddlebags on
Yeah,
their side, and
yeah.
you had to take the saddlebags off to get them through. And that's quite possibly something Jesus was referring to, because they called that gate the eye of the needle. But just simple, think of this. It is absolutely impossible for a person who withholds the wealth of God and accumulates it themselves to in any way reflect the kingdom that God is bringing into being. It's not so much, if you do this, you're not going to get saved and burn in hell forever, although that might be the outcome. The fact is that what you are doing is not what God is doing. And it is opposed and contrary to what God is doing. And it's not that you're not allowed to have the wealth, it's you cannot deploy the wealth by being a reservoir, not a river.
So the problem is not wealth. The problem is hanging on to the wealth and not sharing it.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's interesting, if you read the various parables Jesus spoke about, stewards and unjust stewards, he was actually, if you like, echoing that slave position of the dispensators, because the people he was referring to in the Roman world, they would have been the dispensators of the whole households who were not distributing the master's wealth according to the master's will. And hence they got into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to another one which has been used very badly and often as an excuse for abuse, and that's spare the rod and spoil the child.
Yes, now that's an interesting thing, and it's actually very close to one of the Proverbs. I won't quote it right now. I can't think of chapter and verse, but that's fairly scriptural. Actually, spare the rod and spoil the child. It's true. But the interesting thing is that when we think of the word rod, we think of purely and simply a stick that you hit people with. And it has been horrifically abused to the point where people now say any form of corporal punishment is considered to be abuse. Now, where we are in that debate is not where I want to go right now. What I want to do is point out to something that I remember I discovered this years ago, and whenever I've shared it, people's eyes pop right open. The interesting thing is the word rod there in the Hebrew is shebet. It's translated 9 times in the King James Version, rod, which is where we get spare the rod and spoil the child. This is one of them. But it's translated 180 times tribe. and 10 times scepter, which is the symbol of royal authority.
Yeah.
So basically, if we now pull that out and we put it into its emphasis, it's saying the greatest emphasis is that if we do not cause children to grow in healthy communities, right, their lives will be damaged.
So if we disconnect them from their tribe, if you like.
Yes, and so the emphasis on the autonomous individual, which is, people speak of this society we want of individual expressivism, and somehow or other I've got to be my own individual self, and
You do you,
and
that
ultimate
kind
you
of
do
thing.
you and I'll do
Yeah.
me and all of that sort
Yeah.
of stuff. The Proverbs actually speaking against that. It's saying no, we are called to be community, and this means that we as a society are living in a society which is essentially destructive of children, because we no longer have the capacity as a society to be the tribes that are necessary for the well-being of our children. And that's really quite a serious thing when you think about that. And also the other thing has to do with authority, the scepter. And you can have bad authority, but we live in a society that's suspect of all authority, mainly because it's a threat to our individualism. Instead of working out how to do what's necessary healthily, we basically say, well, because what's necessary isn't being done healthily, we will stop doing what's necessary. And that's kind of upside down. Let me
So-
toss one more thing
Yeah,
into
go on.
that too. This is one you'd love. One of the quotes about the rod, it actually speaks of, is if people misbehave, if iniquity is found in the hearts of the father, then the rod of their anger will fail. And that basically means that if a person is corrupt in their hearts, they will lose their authority to be able to bring life. And I'd say to all of you who are parents, think of the moral and spiritual quality of your lives, because it doesn't matter what you want to do with your children. You can't outsource what you're doing for them. You've got to be attending to your own spiritual and moral formation, because what you are is what your children will become.
Okay, I'm going to do the Rick's amplified version of that quote then, which is really saying, if you take a child out of an environment that is nurturing and loving and teaching them the correct ways to operate in a world where there are authority structures, and we need to be conscious of that. If you take them out of that and divorce them from that and tell them that you do whatever you want to do and everything will be fine, then you're going to corrupt that child and set them off to fail.
Yes.
That's the very amplified version,
Yes.
according to Rick.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And as I say these things, I know how provocative some of the things I'm saying are, and I understand how they can be taken wrongly. They can be abused. There's no safe place in these conversations to guarantee that what you say isn't going to trigger something on the right or on the left. But that's no reason to avoid the conversations. We need to have the conversations and to work it through so that we become people who are internally, morally and spiritually healthy, so that we're helping our children to grow morally and spiritually healthy.
So what we've got here is a scripture that has been used to justify abuse, when in reality it's encouraging exactly the opposite.
Precisely.
That is nurture and care and a safe environment for a child.
Yes. And it's because we treated them in a dumbed down way that we've often used to serve our own agenda when we're a bit frustrated or angry or angsty and we're just annoyed. We want to justify being able to be that way. In fact, if anything, it's the reverse of that.
And we should be clued in enough, if we've spent the time digging into the scriptures and certainly some of the things we've unpacked through these series of conversations, the nature and character of God. We must understand that God would never be encouraging or endorsing abuse of a child.
Precisely, because
It's opposite to his character.
Exactly, and hitting someone to the point where they hurt is introducing suffering. And remember, suffering is not necessarily good for the soul.
As we talked about in the previous episode.
Yes.
Peter, thank you for that. We've got more to go on to this in our next episode, but we'll wrap that up for now. So I guess in case that last conversation has triggered in any way, I guess my final word would be God loves the children. His heart is for children. His heart is not for them to suffer. His heart is for us as parents, and I put myself in that category, to provide an environment where they blossom, where they bloom, where they thrive.
Yeah, and I think of my own parenting over the years of where I've got things wrong and not understood things and induced into my own children dimensions of suffering that were not appropriate. And I think if we're really fair income, we're all muddling along as best we can. But we've got to find and focus and zero in on that intent of focused, loving grace, wanting the best for everybody.
Great way to finish, Pete. Thank you.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless is a production of Rema.cc.